So, this last Friday, I spent my day over at the California resort largely to see the first two shows of the revamped Fantasmic. Just over a year ago, on April 22nd, 2023, that massive animatronic of the dragon, nicknamed Murphy, central to the show's finale, caught on fire and slowly burned to the ground, also destroying the main drop pit and some other show elements that were stored there. In our May 2023 news update, we took a detailed, moment-by-moment look at how the fire started and spread, as well as how the heat caused various failures in the animatronic and fire delivery systems. Though there were no public reports released on the incident, after the fire a number of things likely happened. First, there was all that cleanup. The charred steel skeleton of the dragon wouldn't retract back into the subterranean pit, so a scrim was placed around it as piece by piece it was removed. Beyond this, there was surely an extensive fire investigation, an OSHA investigation, as a few cast members were treated for smoke inhalation, and an internal investigation largely to determine cause, establish safety of using fire effects in the future, and likely to revise existing protocols for using those effects. Beyond this, there was likely an insurance investigation, as insurance money was almost surely claimed for an incident of this size. I bring these up partially to account for the year that the show was down. Serious work on the revised scenes, I've been told, did not begin until last September, 7 months after Murphy burned down. That brings us up to last Friday night. If you've ever been to a ride, show, or even a large restaurant opening at the Florida resort, you know that it's often a crush of people filling the park for a new experience. But this is nothing compared to the crush that descends on the California resort when something new happens there. Guests started staking out spots in the late afternoon for the show. A number of the closest spots were reserved for those who had purchased a Fantasmic dining package. Those with the package could literally show up about 45 minutes before the show and still have a good place to stand. But outside of those reserved seating locations, by 7 p.m., the area around the river was awash with people shoulder to shoulder waiting for the 9 p.m. show. It was the most people that I've seen on this side of the park in months, which I'm guessing is the point. Presently, there's a wall of construction fences, Magnolia Park and the Frontierland Station down past the Haunted Mansion, which will remain closed all summer, past the old Splash Mountain, which is being turned into Tiana's Bayou Adventure, and even past the mini adventures of Winnie the Pooh and the related character meet and greets that usually gather there. That is, the park, especially over the summer, needs not only live entertainment to capture guests, it needs a large event on the west side of the park by New Orleans Square to pull people away from Tomorrowland and Fantasyland and more evenly distribute them throughout the resort. The park now has that draw, but there are some elements in the show that are still not back in their full performance range. The list here of those things that haven't yet returned is fairly short and mostly what we were expecting. During the sequence with Aladdin and Jasmine, where they were once lifted up on a magic carpet and flew above the stage, there is no magic carpet, as that was housed in the same trap area as the dragon when it burned down. Presently, Aladdin and Jasmine come out for a short dance to fill that beat in the show. And of course, the dragon is not back. Instead of Maleficent transforming into some type of enormous dragon, she instead slowly rises to the peak of her lift and remains there with some new pyro to face Mickey in a battle between chaos and imagination. The river still boils with fire, but there's no fire on stage. And now the lift, as it's no longer deeply hidden behind fog and a water screen, has been dressed with thorny vines, so that it appears that the vines that enclose the castle in the movie Sleeping Beauty are what is actually lifting Maleficent into the air. Disney has not announced a replacement for the dragon, but I'm guessing that an announcement is coming, most likely at the D23 event later this year, maybe to premiere in the summer of 2025 as part of Disneyland's 70th anniversary. But as the dragon has been the face of Fantasmic for decades, to the point of being featured on endless advertisements for the show, I find it difficult to believe that the dragon won't come back in some form at some point in the near future. Assuming it does, I'm guessing that a replacement flying carpet lift will perhaps be installed at the same time. But if you look at those internal and external investigations that needed to happen, likely running through the end of 2023, it's clear that nothing of this size could be replaced once Disney had a clear path forward in terms of possible new requirements for a fire effects system on stage. Beyond this, there are some other changes to the show. In 2017, as the show was revamped, Peter Pan left the sailing ship Columbia and was replaced by pirates from Pirates of the Caribbean. The show was being redone in part while the river was shortened to make room for Galaxy's Edge. For years, the Peter Pan ship was followed by Tick-Tock the Croc from the film. The Croc barge with the reshaped river could no longer maneuver from its holding area out onto stage, but this was not a problem if the ship was given over to pirates. Peter Pan is now back, and at that first show, the 8,000 or 9,000 people gathered riverside cheered at its appearance for at least a minute. And here I feel like I need to give a short note to Disney. Characters from animated films typically have a much longer shelf life than those from live-action films. But there was no Croc floating behind the Columbia. Behind the Columbia was actually a maintenance boat pushing the Columbia forward, but more on that in a second. Beyond the return of Peter Pan, I would swear that either the lights or the colored gels were replaced during the closure. They appear brighter and more saturated than what I remember from the show. I would also guess that some of the upgraded tech from World of Color likely made its way over to Fantasmic during this break. Mickey's costume is also slightly changed at times, as is his choreography. And then there were a couple of things that I would put down to first night mishaps. Remember how I mentioned that the sailing ship Columbia, due to mechanical issues, was being pushed around the river by a maintenance boat? This had two consequences for the show. First, because the boat was being pushed, meaning that its forward progress might be a little bit erratic, some of the aerial stunts on the ship appeared to be scrapped for the night. And second, according to a couple of people who work with the show, the additional time to dock and secure the boat as it was being pushed through the water meant that the performers on the Columbia did not have time to leave the ship, change into new costumes, and board the Mark Twain for the show's big finale. So the Mark Twain looked a little light on characters during that first night, but this situation should fix itself once the mechanical problems with the Columbia are resolved. So, was it good to have the show back in the park even if sections remain on B mode? In my opinion, absolutely. For years, if I ducked into the resort for dinner or simply to walk around for a few hours, this would typically be the last thing that I would watch, largely for the spectacle of that 45-foot dragon before heading home. And even though the dragon's not there, replaced by Maleficent on a 35-foot vine-covered lift, it's still nice to have the show back in the park. And that brings up the topic of today's podcast. The creation of Fantasmic decades ago has an interesting backstory filled with multiple inventive shows that were designed or half-designed but never produced, including a massive outdoor show filled with stage illusions focused almost entirely on the Haunted Mansion. So with Fantasmic back on the water, we'll explore the long and sometimes unusual history of water shows that led to Fantasmic and to the development of Fantasmic itself, which is now the longest running show at the resort. As a show, Fantasmic, back in the early 1990s, folded in many design and show elements that had either been developed or proposed over the previous 35 years, both in California and in Florida. At the core of Fantasmic is the idea that the river and Tom Sawyer Island could be converted into a stage. In ways, the river has always been a stage. In July 1955, back when the park first opened, the Mark Twain moved along these waters, often with the Disneyland band seated in white folding chairs, performing at the front of the boat. This in itself, both for those on the boat and for those on the shore, was a show, one that happened most every day. 5 months after the park opened, the Mark Twain was joined by the Mike Fink keel boats. These boats were featured in 2 episodes of the Disneyland Anthology series, 2 episodes called Davy Crockett and the River Pirates. These 2 parts, later joined together, were released as a film. At Disneyland, these were the actual boats that had been used in the movie as part of a river race, now repurposed as a sea ticket attraction. The following summer, the canoes were added to the river along with the rafts that moved guests out to the recently developed Tom Sawyer Island. By then, the river was beginning to look like a very large show, one that depicted American life in the mid-1800s, but still Walt wasn't satisfied. Within weeks of the rafts and the canoes appearing, Walt, speaking to an interviewer, discussed adding yet another ship to the river. "Well, I'm going to add another one," he said. "I'm going to find the right kind of boat, but it's going to be a boat that has to do with our early commerce, you see. It might be Robert Fulton's first steamship or something like that. I'll make a miniature of it that will carry people, the Clermont." What was the Clermont? Well, built in 1807, the real Clermont was the first commercial steamboat in the world, ferrying passengers from New York City up to Albany. That 150-mile trip along the Hudson River took just over 1 day, with the ship moving at 5 miles per hour. It was another paddle wheeler, though unlike the Mark Twain, its paddle wheel was on the side of the boat, fixed roughly halfway between bow and stern. But at Disneyland, the plan to include the Clermont eventually shifted to a different historic vessel, the sailing ship Columbia, a recreation of the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe. This ship first appeared on the rivers of America in 1958. At first, at least, sailors would climb the rigging, man the cannons, and pretend to pilot the boat. For a time in the late 1950s, 2 chimpanzees, also dressed as sailors, appeared on the ship, which was something closer to an actual stage show, especially as those chimps, like human sailors, also climbed up the ropes. By this point, Disneyland had most of the elements it needed to create full-scale entertainment using ships it already owned on the river. And this is where exactly those early seeds for Fantasmic began. During the park's 5th year, on Saturday, October 1st, 1960, from 8 p.m. till 1 a.m., Disneyland held one of its first hard ticket events called Dixieland at Disneyland. It wasn't called a hard ticket event back then, it was called a special party. A ticket for the evening was $4.50. The basic idea was to create a nostalgia event, bringing back some key big bands from the 1940s, as many of these musicians had retired in or around Los Angeles, the home to large segments of the movie, TV, and music businesses. Other acts tended to come into town in the middle or the end of September for a jazz event held at the Shrine Auditorium. Between these 2 groups, local retired jazz musicians and touring musicians who happened to be in Los Angeles, Disneyland eventually would be able to put on a large show, minimizing travel and hosting expenses. Though later Dixieland events had big performers such as Louis Armstrong, Kid Ory, and Johnny Mercer, the very first Dixieland at Disneyland event offered Bob Crosby, Teddy Buckner, and the Young Men from New Orleans. Those young men, I might point out, by this point, had an average age of 61. Musicians who had first found fame 2 or 3 decades earlier, allowing adults in the audience to fondly remember their youth, the same as what happens now out in Epcot at the American Gardens Theater. At the special party, the main musical performance for Dixieland at Disneyland was focused on a water pageant called a salute to Dixieland, where one by one, bands floated downriver on rafts. In 1960, first out were the Dixieland Flyers, who played That's a Plenty, the raft decorated with lights and lampposts like a scene from New Orleans, would be piloted downriver, then stop so guests could see the musicians up close, then move a little further around the bend. One person at the event recalled the experience this way. Well, it was 9 p.m., and the tremendous crowds had already gathered on the banks of the Rivers of America, which is located in Frontierland. A large group of us, which included Walt and his friends, watched the show from the plantation house overlooking the river. Around the bend, floating on rafts, 7 of the best Dixieland bands in the land played their very special versions of the classic old New Orleans jazz. After the Dixieland Flyers was a Disneyland band called the Straw Hatters, who played Georgia Camp Meeting, followed by Teddy Buckner and the Dixieland All-Stars. The final band was the Young Men from New Orleans, which was the big act for the night. They played multiple songs, finishing up with Battle Hymn of the Republic. As they moved into their finale, ground fireworks and pinwheels burst into colorful sparks around Tom Sawyer Island. Then all the bands together participated in a torchlight parade while playing When the Saints Come Marching In. Once the water pageant was over, the various bands traveled to stages across the park, from the Frontierland Gazebo to the Golden Horseshoe Saloon to Carnation Gardens, where they continued with individual concerts. In the following years, when the event returned, the Torchlight Parade was replaced with all of those bands boarding the Mark Twain for a grand finale as the sternwheeler moved around the river with the musicians again belting out "Oh When the Saints." In 1963, a temporary stage was added to the yearly show, a colorful venue designed by wet artist Rolly Crump. Many of the visiting bands would still perform on rafts or on those keelboats so they could be closer to the audience, and the stage would largely be used for professional dancers, and a lot of them. In films I've seen of those early years, I'd say there are about 24 dancers out there, more than in most Disney productions. And with this, the park had many of the key elements that would frame in later river productions, including Fantasmic, the use of rafts dressed with lights and props, a stage arranged at the front of the island, a big musical finale on the Mark Twain, and some low-level ground fireworks used to close the show. Dixieland at Disneyland would continue as a yearly event up until 1970. After that, the river area would host other musical groups and music-focused events, but even by the late 1970s, Fantasmic was still over 2 decades away. The next area of influence came not from California, but from Florida, specifically from Epcot, which at the time was trying to incorporate themes of high art and history into a theme park experience. In the mid-1980s, Disneyland had a large man-made river on which Disneyland Entertainment had created various musical reviews, but for the most part, Disneyland managers could choose to use traditional stages as they saw fit, including the recently opened 1,800-seat Videopolis stage, as the river occupied only a small section of the resort. But the Florida resort, existing in a tropical environment, was riddled with lakes and lagoons. In the 1980s, every Disney-owned hotel and even the campground opened to a water area, from which guests could watch, among other things, the electrical water pageant. The Magic Kingdom itself was hemmed in both by Seven Seas Lagoon and by Bay Lake, and World Showcase at Epcot Center, recently opened in 1982, was focused around a half-mile wide lagoon. This was the natural location for a Disney nighttime spectacular at Epcot, a wide, watery stage with lagoon-side viewing for tens of thousands of guests. To create a show on the water, Disney turned to longtime musical consultant Don Dorsey, who had worked on the Main Street Electrical Parade, and his partner Adam Bizark. The first show they pitched for Epcot was called the Aquatechnics Spectacular, a show that would feature classical music and fountains. Disney turned down this initial proposal, but they did ask Dorsey to create a musical track, a classical montage for a show they decided to produce, Carnaval de Lumière. This show included fountains, firework barges, and cinema-style screens on which to project still images. The show focused on celebrations throughout the world. Images of art, from paintings to drawings to wood carvings, were rear projected onto a flat screen situated on a barge toward the front of the lagoon, a screen that could only be seen well from the front of World Showcase. This was a traditional movie screen, as sophisticated water screens were still a thing of the future. But the off-the-shelf slide projectors used in this effort didn't produce enough lumens to create a detailed image on screen in an outdoor setting. Carnaval de Lumière didn't even last a full season. That show didn't survive, Dorsey explained, due to its content and poor use of technology. The show opened with the park on October 1st, 1982, and was removed a few weeks later. To fix these problems over the winter holidays, Disney paid multimedia consultants to come to Florida and explore options as to how to repurpose the floats, sound system, fountains, and firework equipment that had been created for Lumière. Individually, the consultants were asked to propose concepts for a revised lagoon show. At this point, Dorsey's position was expanded from music into show control systems, specifically the programming for the fireworks and the fountain barges. During meetings in 1983, Dorsey explored his plans with the vice president of the park. Would it be okay, he asked, if I pitched a show idea as well? From there, back in California, Dorsey worked with Adam Bizark and a storyboard artist to develop his pitch for a nighttime show, one that would repurpose much of the existing equipment into a new production, including reworked projection barges that would better handle still images. The small screens of the original show were combined to make larger screens, which would better present new artwork. With this plan, his team assembled a pitch concept and demo video which Dorsey presented in Florida, alongside those produced by other consultants. After reviewing various pitches, park executives decided to fund Dorsey's concept to create a program called A New World Fantasy. Suddenly, I'm in show business, Dorsey said. Suddenly, I'm in charge of the Lagoon Show, and I've got to figure out how to make this work. Like the first World Showcase show, this one, too, was arranged so that the screen viewing area was positioned at the front of the lagoon, from the China Pavilion over to the UK Pavilion. But unlike the first show, this one proved so popular that guests abandoned the restaurants and shops at the back of World Showcase to watch the spectacular in the front half of the lagoon. At the end of the summer season, Epcot executives asked Dorsey to create a new show, or rather an updated show, in which guests could view the show all the way around the lagoon. This began a multi-year cycle of updates and expansions that would define the evolution of the Epcot Lagoon shows. The new show was called Laserphonic Fantasy, a show that would, in essence, cover World Showcase. It's very hard to fill up the entire lagoon, Dorsey said, because it's really big, so we felt that projections didn't work. underscored by classical music performed on synthesizers. The next version of the Lagoon show incorporated high-intensity laser displays projected across the lagoon, with their abstract images visible in rudimentary water screens. But there was one piece of music in Laserphonic Fantasy that Dorsey felt cried out for something a little more human. It always sounded like music someone would ice skate to. To pair sound with an image, the team created a realistic animated human form drawn with laser graphics, an effect that at this level of sophistication had never before been accomplished. When finished, the line art outline of a skater, drawn with lasers projected onto a choppy water screen, presented a girl gliding across an invisible pond, pushing with one skate then the other. It appeared magically like a hologram or an otherworldly vision, ghosting up out of the water jets and mist. This show, like the ones before it, was a musical and visual essay. It didn't tell a story so much as represent through graphic icons the individual identities of the countries that surrounded the lagoon. The unifying element was the music, which was then interpreted and expressed with images, fountains gelled with colored lights, icons and abstract curiosities created with lasers, and low-elevation fireworks. In terms of its intellectual materials, the show was an exploration of future world graphics and national identities arranged in many ways as a lecture without words, topics expressed in pictures and sounds. In 1988, Laserphonic Fantasy evolved into the first of many versions of Illuminations. The most famous version of the Illuminations show, called Reflections of Earth, focused on inferno barges, shooting star fireworks, and a floating globe that opens to reveal an eternal torch. Wouldn't premiere until 1999. And this initial version of Illuminations had none of those now famous effects. Instead, it used standard fountains, barges that held a dozen or so traditional upward jets, to create an aqueous screen made up of about 12 streams on which were projected laser animations. At the time, still, technology did not exist to create a continuous mist screen large enough and thick enough to present a nuanced presentation of a filmed image, but the dozen side-by-side jets did create a screen that could capture easy-to-read geometric outlines. Images presented by laser included animated triangles and squares, the outline of a ship, and the outline of a plane. Even if part of the image was missing, due to gaps in the fountain jets, the audience would immediately recognize the outline of a ship or a plane, and their minds would easily fill in those missing line segments. This was the show that captured the interest of Disney executives who believed that the technology and personnel who had created this show could create an equally sophisticated spectacle in California out on the river. "We had been wanting to do a spectacle on the river for at least 10 years, explained Mike Davis, director of entertainment at Disneyland. "When we saw Illuminations at Disney World, we started thinking about it again." Around this same time, Michael Eisner had a meeting with entertainment director Barnett Ricci. Back in 1972, Ricci had been the dance coordinator for the Main Street Electrical Parade, and in the 1980s, she was the senior show director for the entire parade. She was a key member of the entertainment division at the resort. As she was leaving a meeting with Michael Eisner, Eisner said, "Have you ever thought about doing a show on the river?" From there, Ricci was paired with Don Dorsey, who had created Illuminations, to develop a concept for a new river show at Disneyland. After Illuminations opened at Epcot, Don Dorsey explained, "The search was on for something to do at Disneyland on a larger scale, and my business partner at the time, Adam Bezark, and I came up with an idea based on the Haunted Mansion called The River Haunt." This was a nighttime show that would extend the story found in one attraction to other areas of the park. The idea was that ghosts would come out of the haunted mansion and take over Tom Sawyer's Island on their quest for the 1000th happy haunt and the groom for the bride. At this time in the mansion, the bride was little more than a spooky figure dressed in a wedding dress, situated at the back of the attic, with her red heart illuminated with each beat. The current axe-wielding Constance as bride with her murderous intentions wouldn't show up for a few more decades. The bride in the 1980s, still in her wedding dress, quietly haunted the attic without much of a specific backstory. This left the show design team free to experiment with a story that, at least in some versions, was focused on finding a spirit or a monster groom for this lonely bride. As Don Dorsey recalled, the show, in its various versions, used iconic characters and set pieces from the mansion around which a story was formed. The whole spectacle would take place out on the river, on the island stage, and above the island. Madame Leota came out, Don Dorsey continued, and we had the talking bust, we had the horseless carriage on the water, no horses, but a carriage driving on the water, we had the pirate ship scene. Here are ghost couples waltzing on the water, with underwater apparatus obscured by fountain curtains, and floating organists that would rotate upside down and do all fun and bouncing animations. Though for Illuminations at Epcot, Dorsey had looked largely to evolving technology with lasers to create unique show effects. For River Haunt, he looked to the evolving world of stage magic. We consulted with a couple of very well-known magic designers, Dorsey said, including David Copperfield. These magic designers showed the Disneyland team how to arrange stage illusions on boats, platforms, and a new stage with a trap basement that would need to be built at the front of the island. Another designer, Kevin Kidney, who worked in the Disneyland Entertainment Division, recalled, ideas for an outdoor show on Frontierland's riverfront actually began in the late 1980s, including, I recall, a Haunted Mansion-themed river haunt, with ghosts rising from the mansion and appearing to fly over to the island a la Night on Bald Mountain. Dorsey wanted to focus these visual concepts into an actual story. Up until this time, most of his work for Disney had been focused on visual essays. He created shows where pleasing images, in the form of lasers, fountains, and fireworks, accompanied music to create symphonic dreams that explored a central theme. None of his previous shows told a story. But here he focused his skills on a water pageant that would present a narrative, one focused on guests leaving the mansion and haunting the island. Following the concept art, this show, if built, would have begun with the caretaker and his dog from the mansion out for a nighttime stroll. The pair would appear just as they do in the mansion, right down to the caretaker carrying a handheld lantern. Then strange things begin to happen. A colony of bats rises up from the island, perhaps as outlined laser projections, as fog comes down around the stage area. Then a few ghosts, presumably having just escaped from the mansion, appear, which causes the caretaker and his dog to flee, leaving the island and the river as the new home to the happy haunts from the big building across the way. From here, the show relies in part on stage magic. Pairs of ghosts situated on rafts raise white sheets, ripple them once or twice, so that when the sheets are dropped, a new ghost suddenly appears from behind them, a figure presumably transported from the mansion out onto the river. It's probably worth noting that though Dixieland at Disneyland used the existing rafts for Tom Sawyer Island, the designers of this show were proposing a set of specially built rafts with show lights, a raised platform, greater maneuverability, and a heightened sense of stability, which would be essential for both the stage illusions and later dance numbers. As a few more ghosts arrive, up from the water appear tombstones, and next to them, the heads of the recently departed, rising up quickly just as they do in the graveyard scene in the mansion. These would be mechanical creatures that during the day would be hidden beneath the waterline. Then the ghosts on the rafts, which are human performers dressed in glow-in-the-dark costuming, begin to waltz around as a phantom organist appears near the island. At this point, more ghosts gather on that newly built stage at the front of the island, while others remain on rafts floating much closer to shore. Once the party is going, the giant head of Madame Leota appears in an enormous crystal ball. Again, though never built, this effect looks like something that might have been accomplished with early projection systems or laser technology. From there, out on the water, out of the fog appears the sailing ship Columbia, now dressed with ragged sails, carrying pirates, as those characters as well have presumably escaped from a nearby attraction. From there, 4 medieval knights, just like the knight in the mansion, gather on the stage for another dance number, which culminates in a magic trick. At this point, the caretaker, presumably our hero, places one colored sheet over each of the knights. When the sheets are removed, each knight has lost its metal head. The colored sheets are thrown into a basket in the center of the stage. As a group of angry, mostly headless knights carry the caretaker to the back of the stage, where he's forced into a coffin that is then hoisted high into the air for yet another magic trick. Suspended midair, maybe 15 feet above the stage, the wooden sides open, revealing that the coffin is now empty, with the caretaker appearing magically from that heap of colored sheets that have been in the basket the whole time in the center of the stage. From there, this show reaches into horror stories whose film versions are far more closely associated with Universal Studios. A mad scientist and his assistant open a cage that holds vampires and werewolves, letting them roam free around the island. That same scientist then brings a flat-headed Frankenstein monster back to life with large bolts of electricity. I would assume that this creature brought back to life might be, at least in some version of the script, earmarked as the new resident of the mansion, a creature to be the groom for the mansion's despairing bride. But once alive, this monster destroys part of the scientist's lab, spilling a flammable liquid onto the ground, which, combined with that roaming electricity, ignites and then spreads out into the water, turning the river into a roiling inferno. From here, a giant creature appears above the island who magically helps extinguish the fire. In some concept drawings, the figure is a generic spirit, while in others it's the head of Madame Leota, hovering again in an enormous crystal ball directly above the island. The various ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and monsters are then corralled into the center of the island stage, where the scientist and his assistants enclose them behind a scrim. They stand there as fog again rolls in, and once the scrim is removed, the audience can see that all of the ghosts and various creatures have disappeared. But in reality, the actors have simply fallen through a trapdoor, removing them from the stage and into what would need to be a newly built subterranean trap room. As this happens, that giant spirit, or the giant head of Madame Leota floating above the island, begins to descend behind the tree line, leaving only a few lights on the main stage, where that caretaker appears again with his dog. He looks around at the mill, the stage, the water, all miraculously now calm, just as they had been earlier in the night. He takes off his hat, scratches his head, confused, then ambles off stage with his dog trailing behind, most likely still trying to understand all that had happened over the course of the night. So, we developed this property for several years, Don Dorsey explained. He and the entertainment team did presentations for park executives such as Dick Nunis and company executives over at the studio. It looked like this was the direction that everybody wanted to go, Dorsey said, and then management sort of got scared of the price tag, and they thought, This means we gotta drain the river, and we gotta build a marina in the back for the ships, so it's kind of put on the back burner. But in terms of a path that eventually leads to Fantasmic in this river show, a few more elements enter the ongoing discussion, most notably the use of stage magic, trapdoors, spring traps, spark effects, and a river that roils with fire, all of which designers would have in their minds as they worked forward with later river projects. Beyond individual design elements, River Haunt presented a global design conceit for a river show. River Haunt wasn't just a visual spectacular that presented engaging images combined with music. River Haunt told a story, specifically the story of how nighttime spirits of chaos and evil attempt to take over the island and also disrupt the life of the caretaker. This story, a battle between the forces of good and the nighttime forces of chaos, would stay with the designers as well as they looked to future projects. The next project considered for the river would bring in even more elements that would pave the way toward Fantasmic, elements that would draw on yet another type of performance. I'll be back next week with a new show to continue our story about the long and somewhat unusual road that eventually led to Fantasmic. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.